Raj, I think we'll. Chris, so good to see you.
Great to see you.
And so generous of you to be here during the 7th Global Fund replenishment. I know it's sort of like the biggest day of the year in a lot of ways for you, and a day that we've been looking forward to for years. As I said before, we'd sort of intended that you would give us your readout on something that was scheduled to happen on Monday. Instead, what are you hearing and what are you watching today as that big $18 billion question unfolds?
Well, maybe I can drive back down the 25 blocks at 4:30 when we have an answer, because we will know the number later today. We're going to break a record today for replenishment for the Global Fund, and that's really exciting at a time of, a war and lots of global crises. We really are seeing a global affirmation of the Global Fund as a project and the work that the Global Fund does and the effort to end AIDS, TB, and malaria. The majority of G7 countries, I don't know the exact number yet, we'll know later today, are increasing by 30%. So that's pretty impressive, and we'll see how it plays out today and what the final number is. But in any event, it's going to be a record at a time of a lot of global strife. So that part is good. I think when today is done and we see, then we're all going to have to grapple with the fact that we've been underinvesting in global health for forever. And we saw the outcome of that. And so I think all of us are going to need to think about for the future how we turn that around, how we get back to that kind of sense of global solidarity that we saw for a time in the AIDS movement and in the AIDS response. And just realize that, the funds that are needed to end AIDS, TB, and malaria, the funds that are needed to do pandemic preparedness are decimal points in the cost that COVID wrought on the earth. So we need to get back to global solidarity, but just get smart about a good business plan that is designed to end those epidemics and make us safer.
I don't know if you agree with this. I've been sort of describing this Global Fund replenishment as kind of a barometer for the state of global health financing generally, just because it is this culminating moment where, heads of state or high-level delegates are asked to step forward and come up with something and sort of show what they're willing to put on the table and challenge each other to put more on the table. Do you agree that this is something that we should be watching for broader signals about kind of the health of that financing system? And if so, how is the health of that overall financing system?
I mean, absolutely, it is one barometer and one of the most important. But I also think, the target today is $18 billion. That's what the Global Fund says it needs, at least. They might make it. If they don't, I think we need to understand, we need to look closely at what actually happened. Germany increased their pledge by 30% at a time when they're heading into a recession and we know about their energy costs. The United States is pledging $6 billion, a third of the Global Fund need today.
Contingent on other countries stepping up, though.
There is a match requirement for that, that's right. But if other countries step forward within the next year, then we'll realize that pledge. So whether we make the exact number or not, I do think, again, you're seeing an affirmation by G7 leading countries and donors for the Global Fund and the investment to end AIDS, TB, and malaria. In part, I think, because they're recognizing, and I think we all need to do more of this, right, is COVID was a test case. And in COVID, you saw the Global Fund, PEPFAR, President's Malaria Initiative, these other global initiatives play a huge role in country COVID responses. And that tells you something, right? That is, we're thinking about the next pandemic and pandemic preparedness. First of all, there's no health security for millions around the world if we don't end AIDS, TB, and malaria as epidemics. But two, those systems that we've constructed already, Global Fund, PEPFAR, the others, are there for pandemic preparedness, are responsive when something happens. So, I think donors are seeing, even in tough times that we are in now, this investment makes a lot of sense for them.
Still some big question marks out there. The UK government being one of them.
That's right.
A government in a period of transition, but also, like all of the others, facing a lot of competing pressures when it comes to international financing or issues of international concern. Any insights into what we might expect from the UK? I think that's sort of, I talked about the whole replenishment being a barometer, but that's maybe a mini barometer in terms of some of these countries that could go one way or the other.
As of right now, I don't know whether the UK will appear today. I think we need to let a few hours play out. I do believe if they don't pledge today, they will pledge within the next month.
Great.
So yeah. So that's the other thing about the number at the end of the day. I think that we need to take it in context.
So you talked about how institutions, organizations like the Global Fund have served as these platforms during COVID and really leveraged the systems that they've built over the last decades to reach people. Is the Global Fund that leaders are pledging to today a different institution than the Global Fund that existed during the sixth replenishment when I was last, covering this this day? Is it a fundamentally different organization for tackling health challenges in developing countries?
I think it's fundamentally the same. I think the model is fundamentally the same. Country-driven, multiple stakeholders engaged in decision-making, including civil society, investment in communities, investment in human rights, and a preference on equity. Although all those remain the same, and very oriented around results and reporting lives saved, and commodities delivered, et cetera. Those haven't changed. I think what has changed is COVID happened. And we saw that the Global Fund really rose to the occasion. It created a new funding mechanism. The United States was incredibly generous in financing most of that. And it made a huge impact. I mean, the results report for the Global Fund came out a couple of weeks ago. Yes, COVID hit the HTB and malaria responses really hard. But already, because of that COVID-19 response mechanism investment to help countries with COVID, AIDS, TB, and malaria programs are all beginning to bounce back. So I think what's different is we've all seen the pandemic preparedness and response role that the Global Fund did play, and it really rose to the occasion the way many multilaterals did not. And so I think that's a proof point, and I think that has meaning going forward. It means that as we talk about financial intermediary fund at the World Bank and other approaches to pandemic preparedness, Global Fund needs to be at the center. It needs to be a central recipient of the financial intermediary fund if that fund wants to invest in stronger health systems. And it needs to be at the center of the conversation about preparedness, because at the center of that conversation, we need to have health systems. And the Global Fund knows how to do that. And I think one thing that is looking forward a little different is I think the Global Fund will be more intentional about making investments that are health system strengthening and that are related to pandemic preparedness. Already about a third of their investments go towards those types of things. I think they'll probably be more intentional about that in the future. But at the end of the day, job number one is ending AIDS, TB, and malaria as epidemics. And again, in doing that work, you are laying the groundwork for preparedness.
We've certainly heard similar strategic messaging from PEPFAR and from the new head of PEPFAR, John Kengasong, in a recent interview that we did with him. He said the best way to tackle unknowns is to invest in the knowns, specifically PEPFAR in his case. And granted, he has an interest in seeing that investment in PEPFAR. But I think it fits into this bigger question of, do the institutions that we have today rise to the challenge, as you're saying? Do they provide an adequate basis for tackling diseases that we may not even know about yet? Or do we need to be creating something entirely new that can fill the gaps that exist in the pandemic preparedness and response architecture? You are obviously an advocate for the Global Fund. You believe in its platform and the systems that it's built. But we are seeing new things emerge, like the Financial Intermediary Fund at the World Bank. Where do you fall on this question of reinvention versus increased investment?
I'm a Global Fund advocate, but really I'm just an old AIDS activist. So what I'm about is results. and getting ahead of disease and saving life. And I think, you know, I don't, certainly the idea of creating new silos in global health doesn't make sense to me. I think what the challenge of the coming years is going to be closing that financing gap, um, really putting communities and countries in the driver's seat in terms of how decisions are made around health investments, but then also rationalizing somehow this system of multiple different programs. How do they all combine and stay in touch and coordinate in a way that strengthens health systems that deliver for people today, right? And therefore are also better able to identify a new threat and respond to it. I think that's what we need to do. I think part of the challenge there is bringing political leaders along, because political leaders really, many of them really like disease-specific programming. You can be very, get your metrics in terms of lives saved. So I think as we wade into more of a systems way of approaching, we need to keep those metrics. We need to keep able to report the impact and the lives saved that we're having for people. But I think that's doable, because I think COVID opened policymakers' eyes to the importance of systems. And so I think the challenge for us now is, how do we use our current institutions and fund those and put communities in charge of decision-making around them?
This is one of the reasons we were excited to bring you up here today, is that you have that perspective working on the inside, on the political side, on Capitol Hill, making the case for these investments, but making them in ways that appeal to political leaders in the United States who are facing all kinds of different constituencies and interests. In a post-COVID world, how do you see that messaging shifting? What needs to happen now to keep up that kind of political support for disease-specific programs or for this pandemic preparedness architecture in the sort of phase of COVID that we seem to be entering?
Yeah, I somehow seem to have found myself working in the last bipartisan issue in the United States. Global health does remain bipartisan, and I don't see that changing. I don't see any sign of that changing, and I think that's wonderful. That's the good news. I think to keep that bipartisan support, some things are really necessary. We've got to stick with showing the results, and we've got to stick with the transparency, and including multiple stakeholders in decision making. These are all things that members of Congress want to hear about, because it makes a lot of sense. If a constituent says, "Why did you send some of my hard-earned tax money overseas?" The answer is, "Look how many lives we've saved this year, and all the good that did in communities, and all the stability that brought in countries, and how that's tied to trade for us, and how that's tied to diplomatic goals for us." So I think we can keep it bipartisan. I think what is the challenge of the next couple years is we need to up the investment, not just in the United States, but by other donor countries, by implementing countries in their own health care. We need to figure out how multilateral development banks playing in here in terms of financing. There's this new vehicle at the World Bank. How do we get these capacitated where they need to be? And again, at a decimal point on what COVID cost us, and not just have them kind of cannibalizing each other. So growing that pie is the challenge ahead. And exactly how to do it, I don't know, but I do know that showing the results. One of the amazing facts that I want to spend the next year talking about is, this was also in the results report from Global Fund. From 2000, I know, COVID hit life expectancy hard. We just heard that. But, from 2002 to 2019, in 15 sub-Saharan African countries, life expectancy went up almost 14 years. People are living 14 years longer on average in those 15 countries. And more than half of those years gained are because of progress we made on AIDS, TB, and malaria. That's pretty compelling. You're talking about every individual in there on average living a decade and a half more almost. So we do have this incredible story to tell. We do have the results. And I think that what we need to do is get out of being caught in the insufficient funding place. Because again, if you think of it as a business model, right, that's not a winning business model. We need to, epidemics, you don't tread water with them. You've got to either be winning against them or they're defeating you. And so we do need to think about how do we step up the scale of what we're delivering so we can really dramatically drive down incidence and mortality in the 3 diseases while we're strengthening systems.
Do you expect the US midterms to change the political calculus around these issues in the United States at all?
I don't. If the House, for example, were to flip, I mean, on both in the House and the Senate, the leaders in appropriations are people who get it on global health. They're proud of America's investment in global health, and they should be. They know how to explain why they support it. We just had a congressional awards event a couple months ago, and we gave 6 awards, 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans. All of them spoke very personally about how this matters to them. So I think whichever way the election goes in November, we've got really strong supporters on Capitol Hill.
Great. Well, Chris, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been illuminating. I know you have to probably hop in a cab and go find out what's really happening, and I'm sure you'll be getting calls from us later.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.